And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution is not going to get that man today. No, because I'm going to get him.
I was 13 years old. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And even at that young age, I questioned the lone gunman theory, always thinking that perhaps there was a conspiracy here. Years later, Martin Luther King died, and I did the same thing. I didn't think James Earl Ray acted alone. I wasn't even sure he did it. As a matter of fact, the King family does not believe that James Earl Ray was the assassin. Then later on, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. And, of course, you know the latest story. Of course, a witness says, look, there were more than one gunman. Sirhan did not act alone. There was somebody else there. A lot of people have called these conspiracies over the years. And they've laughed at people who thought of it. But are they laughing anymore? In a moment, Webster Tarpley joins us. We're going to talk with him about the minds of people who believe in conspiracies. Why do they think the way they think? And where does it lead us later on? We'll be back in a moment with Webster Tarpley on Coast to Coast AM. Now, our guest tonight, Webster Tarpley, was with me a year ago as we talked about his latest work, Surviving the Cataclysm, Your Guide to the Worst Financial Crisis in Human History. And boy, he was right on, spot on. He's a philosopher of history, seeks to provide the programs and strategies needed to overcome current world crises. He's an activist, a historian. He was widely known for his book, George Bush, the Unauthorized Biography, currently completing a study of Pearl Harbor as an episode in Wall Street's war against President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal, and FDR's Economic Bill of Rights. We're going to talk with him about that as well. Welcome back, Webster Tarpley. Webster, how are you?
Thank you very much, George. I'm fine.
Spent the day today watching the various segments of you and debates and stuff. You're a great orator, my friend.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I succeed in convincing some people because we're going to need it.
Well, at that time, I think you were debating David Frum, and Jonathan Kay was there.
Well, just one point is that David Frum from the Bush White House, the top neocon, Canadian origin, the guy who probably invented the phrase "the axis of evil" in the Bush State of the Union of January 2002. He was supposed to be the chairman. He was neutral, but of course the way it turned out was it was the front of Frum and Jonathan Kay of the National Post, also of Canada, who were lining up against me. So that was fine.
It was a good debate. It was good speaks. And one of the things I noticed, and that's what I want to talk with you a lot about tonight, Webster, is the audience. Every time one of the two would talk about the media not being controlled or, there are no conspiracies, the audience laughed at them. Did you notice that?
Yes. Well, there is an explanation. I mean, this is maybe not exactly a completely unbiased sample. A lot of these people were from the 9/11 Truth Movement in the Washington, D.C. area.
Okay.
And since there's so little opportunity to debate this stuff in any kind of reasonable way, they came down and took advantage to grill Kay to some extent, but also Frum, who got probably grilled even more. But I believe that there is a somewhat greater sophistication today than there was. In other words, there's an attitude of less gullibility, in particular by some people who were gulled and duped by Obama and not anymore, and maybe they were gulled and duped in the 2010 election and probably not anymore. So let's hope for the best in that regard.
Let's talk, Webster, about the mind of a conspiracy theorist, first of all. What is happening to people where they just don't believe? Because in many cases, it's not one story. It's not just the JFK assassination. It's not just Robert F. Kennedy. Was there a couple shooters? It's almost everything with people who are diehard believers in conspiracies. Why don't they believe the general mainstream story anymore?
Well, I think the short answer is because the official account of reality.
Give me the long one. You're on for 3 hours.
Is now discredited. In other words, the official story of all the things that you've mentioned and so many more is fantastic. It is unbelievable. Let me just say first, though, I'm not a conspiracy theorist in the way that some people might be. The goal,
but you're labeled. You're labeled as that. You know that.
Fine. I mean, what goes up on Wikipedia, I can't control. I'd have to spend the whole day.
Yeah.
But here's the idea. What I'm interested in as a historian and as hopefully a political activist of some kind is the truth. In other words, what actually happened. The goal is not to discover conspiracies. The thing, though, is that when you try to find out what actually happened, many times conspiracies arise. You find conspiracies.
Many.
And then the question is, what do you do? Do you suppress your knowledge? Do you dodge it? Do you avoid them and say, oh, my God, if I talk about this, I'm going to be ostracized as a conspiracy theorist, a paranoid, a kook? Or do I tell what I've actually found? The one way to understand this is, if you remember, Plato divides societies in any number of ways. You can have a tyranny, right, the rule of one person, Hitler, Stalin.
Sure.
You can have a mob at the other end of the extremes. In those cases, you don't have conspiracy. For example, if Stalin or Hitler, at the height of their power, want something done, they write an order. It gets done.
It gets done. They do it.
Comrade X is executed, whatever it is. They don't need conspiracy. At the other extreme, and this is also rare, is a purely spontaneous mob. In other words, a group of people who are essentially a leaderless group, and they're all, extremely excited and going wild, and, just things happen. But in the middle, and the middle is huge, in other words, in that broad stretch of human affairs between the spontaneous mob and the absolute tyrant, you're dealing with oligarchy, and you're dealing, above all, with oligarchy in the society of our times, right? We live, especially in the English-speaking world, but then more and more in the entire world, in an oligarchy run by financiers, an oligarchy or aristocracy or plutocracy run by bankers, hedge fund operators, and so forth. And I think that's evident to everybody. So in that world, the characteristic mode of action is some kind of conspiracy. You could call it pre-concert or deliberation or a plan or any number of terms. And in that case, you have to face facts. The other thing that we have is, and this I think the really interesting thing to talk about tonight is, here in the United States, we have had a form of secret government. Right? It's been called the secret government, the parallel government, the invisible government.
The shadow government, yeah.
The shadow government, the deep state. Sometimes it's referred to as this town, meaning Washington, D.C. We've got a kind of secret rule, which I take to be the point at which Wall Street, at a very high level, intersects people in the State Department, the CIA, and perhaps the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, those agencies. But above all, in the international realm of war and peace, security, espionage, and things like this. If you can think of the figure of Allen Dulles, right, the founder of the creator, if not the founder of the Cold War CIA, the guy who then piloted the Kennedy assassination cover-up. If you look at Allen Dulles as a Wall Street bond lawyer in Switzerland during World War I, in Switzerland again during World War II.
He was everywhere.
Deeply involved with the Nazis, without doubt, trying to arrange a separate surrender of the Nazis in the West and maybe keep the war going against the Russians in the East. And then his brother, Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, right, bringing in the State Department.
Mm-hmm.
If you can imagine these sorts of people, in other words, very senior operatives, typically Wall Street bond lawyers or something like that.
With incredible power, Webster. Incredible power.
This is where power is actually located. In other words, this is where you can trace it well into the 60s, into the 70s, and into the 80s. Now, this particular form of invisible government has been around, according to my count, since about 1895. It arises under Grover Cleveland, if I could just tell this little story. Under Grover Cleveland in about 1895, you have the British organizing a run on the gold backing of the U.S. dollar. They try to destroy the United States financially by essentially getting a panic going, so everybody demands gold, and the gold stocks of the United States go down to virtually nothing.
Okay.
At that point, Grover Cleveland, the president, who was he's a Wall Street puppet, as so many are, he calls in J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan says to him, "We will call off our dogs, but we want to control the public debt of the United States. And you will give us preferential treatment. You're going to buy things from us at higher prices than you would normally pay." In other words, it's the moment where Wall Street definitively takes control of the public debt of the United States.
Dictating that to the President of the United States.
Dictating that. Grover Cleveland goes down on his knees. Now, that is already the reality of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve comes 20 years later, more or less. But that's already the power relation. The Federal Reserve creates an institution, a cover, it legalizes, it consolidates, it sets it all up. But it really goes back to Grover Cleveland. And the idea is that the Federal Treasury is subservient to Wall Street. Wall Street will dominate the Federal Treasury. For people who are really interested in this kind of stuff, you can go back to the period 1811 to 1816, and you will see an attempt to form a similar invisible government by John Jacob Astor of the Astor Interests, famous, and the Girard Bank of Philadelphia. They try and succeed to some extent to take over parts of the federal government during that time for reasons that are maybe too complicated to go into here. But suffice it to say for right now, since 1895, we have had two governments. One is the elected legal one.
Right. The one we think we know.
The one we think we know. And then there's the one that's above and behind that, above and behind the Oval Office, above and behind the presidency and the cabinet and the Congress and the Supreme Court. Don't forget them. And that is this financial octopus of Wall Street. So from time to time, the personnel of the invisible government are very visible, right? Allen Dulles was no secret. John Foster Dulles was no secret. Woodrow Wilson was no secret. Obama is no secret, and lots of others. But generally speaking, the full extent of the invisible government is hidden. And then we have this catalog that you were just alluding to, right? You go through U.S. history. You get things like the McKinley assassination. You get the blowing up of the Maine. It starts right away, right? It starts if the invisible government in its current form was founded in 1895, you begin to see the fruits of that, within a few years. McKinley assassination, the blowing up of the Maine and Havana Harbor, the Spanish-American War, the founding of an empire, right? And that has just kept going. The U.S. entry into World War I, that's actually an interesting one. J.P. Morgan, once again, goes to Woodrow Wilson and says the British and the French will be bankrupt in 1917, so we have to get into the war. See to it. And Woodrow Wilson jumps to it and does what they want him to do. Later, I guess he's horrified later on, but by then he's done it. Then you get the things that I would like to focus on, the 5 or 6 attacks by the invisible government against Franklin D. Roosevelt, who really, out of this entire time, was the most serious challenge to their power. But then we get into things like the Cold War. I think if you want to give one individual credit for the Cold War, it's Averell Harriman of the Brown Brothers Harriman banking house.
Right, and he was around for a long time in politics.
Right, and his partner, Robert Lovett, and we'll probably get back to him in the course of the evening. But then you get things like the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy assassination, the Gulf of Tonkin, the Vietnam War, on and on, Iran-Contra, bombing of Serbia.
Let's bring this back, though, to the individual for a moment, Webster. And I want to spend a lot of time in next hour on your Pearl Harbor upcoming book, and a little bit when we come back from the break on that too. It's a huge story, but I'm fascinated by the mind of someone who believes in conspiracies when they don't have the kind of information you have or others might get, but they go on the internet, they do searching, they'll go to your website, they'll go to mine, they'll go to Alex Jones, And they come up with these incredible theories that may be true of these conspiracies. How did they get to that point? What pushed them?
Well, look, here's the problem. The institutions of this society that we're living in right now are all discredited. Not one of them is reliable. It starts with the political institutions, the presidency, the Congress, the judiciary, and so forth. It extends to academia, right, the land of the postmodernists.
There's no confidence in any of them.
So all of these are discredited. Now, what that creates is a situation which I agree is not good. You can also extend that to the medical establishment. You can extend it to corporations. You can basically go across the board. There's basically nobody that you can trust, and what it indicates is that we're living in a huge crisis of civilization. That then means that the individual is adrift on a sea of doubt and mistrust and God knows what. And people have to essentially make things up on their own as they go along. This is not a good situation. This is not something that I want. But this is the reality. And the only way to get out of this is to recognize the truth of what got us here. The invisible government has policies. As Senator Inouye of Hawaii once said during some of the Iran-Contra hearings, there's a secret government. They have their foreign policy, their financial policy, and they have their views on a whole bunch of related things. And this cannot be avowed openly to the American people. You can look at a couple of examples. Maybe 9/11 is a good way to hook into it. And of course, I hope people will read my 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA that they can find at progressivepress.com. But if you look in here, suppose I tell the American people, well, the United States banking establishment and the British banks are concerned that economic development might take hold in Afghanistan. There might be some railroads built that would go from India to Europe. There might be some oil pipelines and gas pipelines built that would have the tendency to give all of the countries in the region a common economic interest so that they would henceforth tend to work together. If we had, in addition, Pakistan in a peaceful situation, we could have an oil pipeline from Iran through Pakistan into China. We could have oil coming from Iraq and Iran across Pakistan into India. We tend to bind them all together. And at that point, this invisible government says, no, this is not what we want. We want them to be at each other's throats.
We want chaos.
We want chaos. We want divide and conquer. We want to have them in a situation of subordination on the defensive. We don't want them prosperous. We want them desperate. And we don't want them to emerge as competition to us, strategically, militarily, commercially, or any other way. Now, it's going to be hard to go to the American people, right, to go out to, think of any...
Wichita.
Right, real people, right?
Yep.
And you go to the real people and say, guess what? We want you to volunteer, or if you don't, we're going to draft you, for this kind of a war. And the goal is basically to export the Afghan civil war into Pakistan so that we can destabilize Pakistan, cut that country up into 4 or 5 units. We want to destroy Iraq because it's the leading Arab state, and we also want to destroy Syria. For this, you should fight and die and pay. It can't be done in this way. So therefore, they fall back on the obvious trick, which is the false flag terror event, right? The provocation, the wag the dog, and so forth. And the problem with that is that once you have a ruling class that is so incompetent that they begin to go down this path, this is like heroin addiction, right? You're going to need to have that again and again and again in bigger and bigger doses.
Right. It's got to get bigger. You're right.
And whatever the advantage, you can think about 9/11. Again, the advantage of 9/11 was for most people, this was out of a clear blue sky, a shock, right? A shock that many will never forget. The problem with that is that the shock depended on the surprise. And the attempt to repeat this, to duplicate it, right? Just in the past week, we had yet another one of these FBI entrapment cases. We had a bunch of mental deficients, right? Some of them with beards, I think, who wanted to blow up a bridge.
The Cleveland kids.
In the Cleveland area.
Hold on, Webster. We're going to hit this break. We're going to come right back and talk more about the mind of those who believe in conspiracies, and he's citing some examples here on why they do I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. It's Conspiracy Night here on Coast to Coast AM. Webster Tarpley, our special guest, and we'll be right back with him in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back. Webster Tarpley with us. Webster, you've got to agree that not everything is a conspiracy.
No, it's not. And I think that's a fundamental point. There's reality. The bedrock of reality is economics. It's also military, it's political. This is solid reality. I would warn anybody who says that there's nothing in the world but conspiracies. That's when you have to think about paranoia, because that's losing credibility,
everything.
Well, you got to hold on to reality. Now, you could also argue, for example, take the World Economic Depression of today, right? This is real. This is objective reality, not a conspiracy. At the same time, you could argue that the World Economic Depression that we have, caused by derivatives and centering in these Wall Street institutions with the various practices that they have, you could argue that that's the residue. It's the result of thousands and thousands of decisions over decades, which may have been shaped by, groups of people acting together with deliberation, planning, and pre-concert.
Oh, you could also argue that it was a plan and is a plan to generate this one world government, this one world economy.
Yeah, I look at it rather differently. One of the things that's objective is when you show a Wall Street financier a derivative, right, a collateralized debt obligation, a credit default swap, a commodity swap, or something
exchange.
Like this. Yeah, this is like showing a heroin addict a big dose of heroin. They just can't help themselves. In other words, the idea of creating bubbles is all they know, right? They want to have manias and bubbles, and then this always leads to crashes and panics, and they don't learn. And this somehow is objective. In other words, it's a syndrome that they have over and over again, and as long as you have deregulated finance capital, then you're going to have that. So, but again, I think you're very right. Not everything is a conspiracy. Within the framework of reality, though, there are conspiracies.
Sure.
There's no point in trying to ignore these.
Webster, what got you interested in all this from the get-go? At some point in your career and your life, something happened, some event, you saw something. What was it?
Yeah, it was actually in a fairly interesting setting. I was in Rome in 1977, 1978, working as a reporter. I'm working in downtown Rome. Right across the street is the Christian Democratic Party headquarters, and the Vatican is maybe a mile away. Aldo Moro, the Prime Minister of Italy, was kidnapped in March of 1978. His bodyguards were all killed. This was a very well-planned military operation. He was then taken to a secret location and kept there for a couple of months. And he was then shot, killed, murdered. His body was found in the trunk of a car about 2 blocks from my office, Via Caetani, near Palazzo Caetani, right in the heart of downtown Rome. After he had been killed and this period of extreme tension was over, I was approached by a former member of the Italian government. He was the former deputy secretary of police, well, interior. But interior for them means police, internal security. It doesn't mean, national parks.
Right.
So the former state secretary of the interior, Zamberletti, starting with a Z, said to me, Tarpley, why don't you do a study of the media treatment of the Moro kidnapping and assassination and see what you find. So I had a group of friends. We were in Germany in the summer of 1978. We spent about 2 months doing a rather comprehensive review, and we came up with something more than he asked for. I mean, we took it much further than he actually wanted, and we concluded that NATO intelligence had been responsible for this. Not that the Red Brigade, the terrorist group that was usually accused, was not an independent revolutionary or terrorist organization, but it was a tentacle of NATO intelligence. And the goal of this was what I would call spheres of influence terrorism. The goal being the U.S. and the British had an idea that the Soviets were condemned by Yalta, although this is a misreading of Yalta. They would say by Yalta to stay out of Western Europe, and that the Italian Communist Party would not be allowed to join the government majority and put ministers into the government. And Moro wanted to do this because Moro's goal was not communism. It was to have a stable majority so that you could have stable long-term governments rather than the ones that I was following there in Rome in the 70s. The average government was lasting about 8 months, 9 months, 10 months.
And out they went.
Would keep falling.
Yeah.
So he wanted this kind of stability. The NATO people didn't want it, so they went into action using a counter gang, right? This Red Brigades, like the Baader-Meinhof group was used in Germany
Sure.
The previous year, actually.
Real groups that are out there, but they were able to tap into them.
They're real psychotics. They're what I call patsies, right? In this typology, I have of patsies, moles, and technicians. These are patsies. These are fanatics, psychotics, double agents, mercenaries, drug addicts, criminal elements.
Who would do anything for money or whatever.
They can also be megalomaniacs,
right?
Mythomaniacs. They want to be famous at any cost, and they're willing to get killed if they can become famous in the process.
Haven't we heard that before, Webster? Huh?
But remember also that in many cases the actual kidnapping and killing is not done by the group that is eager to take credit for it, but actually by trained professionals, the people that you don't see. These are the technicians. There's a very interesting movie that shows this. If you've ever seen The Package with Gene Hackman.
I may have. I don't remember.
The Package. Here you see Tommy Lee Jones is the trained killer who's actually going to kill essentially Gorbachev, in quotes, in Chicago at the end of the 1980s, and the forces behind this assassination.
I did see that one.
They have brought a patsy, a sort of a low-grade subject. He's a U.S. Army soldier from Germany who's brought back and told to infiltrate a neo-Nazi group. So you see it all. You see the moles, you see the patsies, you see the technicians. You get a pretty good overview of the entire thing. Well,
let's talk for just a moment about 9/11. Then I want to spend some time on your upcoming book about Pearl Harbor. When does that come out, by the way?
It's built for summer 2012, so it's
right around the
final throes of composition. But it should by summer, the end of the summer, I guess by August, September, it'll be available. I had meant to put this out for the 70th anniversary, but I ended up traveling in the Middle East. Right, trips to Libya, Syria, Iran have sort of slowed it down by a couple of months. We apologize to people that are waiting for it.
All right. Much like your thought about the Red Brigade, an organization, a group that's out there and is tapped into, I think a lot of problems that are created by conspiracy theorists, and I have my own conspiracies about a lot of things, but let's talk about 9/11. I mean, they simply say the U.S. government did it, end of story, that's it. I want to take it a step further, and I want your views on this, Webster. I think there's no doubt that this group that calls itself Al-Qaeda was out there, regardless of who funds them and where they came from, in that these crazed fanatics were participating in this endeavor on 9/11, many of whom who were on that plane did not know they were going to crash into buildings. I think one or two in each plane did. And what people seem to have forgotten is I think this shadow government, this group that wants to control, manipulate, and create havoc throughout this planet, went to them and said, hey, we need to do something like this. And they did it. Maybe with the help of bin Laden, maybe not, but they were still all part of it. I think anybody who says that these crazed militants weren't there, I think they're making a mistake. Now, what do you say about this?
Well, first of all, when you say the government did it, this is absurd in the following sense. It can't be the whole government. It has to be a network ensconced within the government, right, cutting across it transversely near the top, right? You need somebody at the top of the CIA, somebody at the top of the FBI, NSA, DIA, National Reconnaissance Office, satellite imaging, that's a big one. The Pentagon, of course.
NATO, maybe NATO
network,
right?
And that's the rogue network. Now, this is a private network. The government did it. This is foolish. Wall Street did it in the last analysis. In other words, the goal of this entire thing is to unleash the war of civilizations, the clash of civilizations, described by Samuel Huntington in his book of the same name. That is to say, if we can't organize the world around the Cold War, U.S. against Soviets anymore, then we have to find a new way to do it, and we're going to do it as the neocon reading was, we'll do it as the West against Islam. Samuel Huntington's reading was really, let's have Islam against, Russia, the Orthodox world, or let's have Latin America against Africa, anything to keep them fighting among themselves.
They want fights.
They want fights, of course. That's divide and conquer, right? The motto of the British Foreign Office. So it can't be the government, and we can show this in 9/11. But when you say Al Qaeda, look, the other thing about these incidents is you can't keep secrets over a long period of time. Now, my thesis about Al Qaeda has always been simple. Al Qaeda is the CIA Arab Legion, created by the United States, starting under Carter and Brzezinski, to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Yeah, the Mujahideen, right?
Mujahideen. The Al Qaeda is a list of patsies, fanatics, and other people that could be called in to Afghanistan from Arab countries, right? Saudis, Algerians, Libyans, and all sorts of other people, to go and fight these infidel Soviets in Afghanistan. However, over time, they needed this for another purpose, right? They needed it for 9/11 purposes. But now, more recently, what do we see? Having been in Libya and Syria too, I can tell you that the death squads, for example, today in Syria, those are Al Qaeda, and they are doing exactly what the CIA and the British MI6 are telling them to do. In other words, the infantry of NATO, when NATO was bombing Libya, what was attacking Libya on the ground were forces where the only effective units were Al-Qaeda veteran fighters coming from Chechnya, coming from Afghanistan, coming from Algeria, where they'd been killing people in the 1990s and so forth. In other words, the idea of Al-Qaeda as the CIA Arab Legion, as this auxiliary, is very, very obvious. And we can even give individuals, right? There's this guy called Belhaj, or Hasidi, he has many names. He was a former prisoner of war of the United States in Pakistan, Afghanistan. He then ended up in this area between Benghazi and Tobruk, Libya. He was then made the military governor of Tripoli, Libya. So Libya today is under the control of a government where Al-Qaeda is a large faction. And there are parts of Libya today that are run by Al-Qaeda. I have to laugh when I see Obama in Afghanistan saying, we don't want Afghanistan to become a sanctuary for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda doesn't want that. They can have a sanctuary in Libya, which is so much better, so close to Europe, right, with the Mediterranean there, and all those routes into Africa, easy travel in all directions. They don't want.
Well, yet these leaders like Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and Assad in Syria, they aren't Boy Scouts, and they weren't Boy Scouts. I mean, they did treacherous things.
Clearly, but this is none of our affair, right?
No. The problem is, though, we've supported people who've done the same thing, except they played ball with us. The Shah of Iran, Noriega at the time, until he changed his tune and we got rid of him.
The thing you have to see is that you install a puppet in a country, and because of the dynamic of the national state, which is why they want to destroy it, the national state will take a puppet and make him act like a nationalist because he's got to defend national interests. And once they've been entrenched for 20, 30, 40 years, like Gaddafi, Mubarak,
Saddam,
the guy in Yemen, Saddam, they are acting like satraps. Okay, they're acting as viceroys of the U.S. empire, but they have a lot of autonomy. If you take Mubarak, for example, the U.S. went to Mubarak and said after 9/11, hey, Mubarak, we want Egyptian troops to go to Afghanistan. The answer was no. Then a year later, hey, Mubarak, we want Egyptian troops to go fight in Iraq. The answer was no. Hey, Mubarak, we want a U.S. base in Egypt. No. Hey, Mubarak, we want you to have a direct military alliance with the Israelis. No. So no. And then they said, all right, fine. We're getting rid of you.
Enough
We've
with
got
you.
these crazy kids.
All right.
And we've got the Muslim Brotherhood.
And off they go. And now what? We had about the 20 people killed in a demonstration in Egypt yesterday? I mean, it's crazy.
These are color revolutions. Now, this is also...
All right, but this group, though, Webster, this higher-powered group, is it worldwide? It's not just here.
No, I think this here you have to watch out. I would warn people. I've heard people say, well, Putin is just as much a part of this as anybody else, and the Chinese are just as much a part of it as anybody else. No, no, no. This is Anglo-American finance capital. This is the British. It's the City of London. It's Wall Street. The Israelis are in many ways an appendage of that. And after that, the step down is a very big one. When you go from London to Paris, right? Paris is already several steps down. When you go to Berlin, there's another bunch of steps down. By the time you get to Moscow, it's further down. This is not a unified global faction of finance capital. At least I don't think it is yet. And it's the reason being that these national states continue to exist, and the Russian state imposes a logic even on a person like Medvedev. I mean, Putin is a superior case, but Medvedev is obviously a weakling and an appeaser who was eager to sell out Russian interests.
He's Putin's right-hand man. Whatever.
No, I don't see it that way at all. I see that, but because of Putin's desire to maintain legality, right, and to leave this term limits provision the way it was, especially since he could shift over to being prime minister and have a great deal of power. When Medvedev came in, the entire Western world, NATO, CIA, MI6, they all battened on Medvedev, saying, we're going to build you up, and we're going to make you into something more powerful than Putin. And the result is what we saw with Libya. Medvedev is the one who gave the order in the Security Council not to vote against the Libyan resolution. And everybody knew what it meant. It meant the bombing of Libya. It meant the bombing campaign, which I have been under, right? I've seen the bombs coming down. I've seen the ruins, lots and lots of slaughter. I've seen, a young father whose wife and young kids had been murdered by NATO bombs in the night. They knew all that. And it would mean an invasion, and it would mean, 150,000 dead. I think that's what it turned out to be in Libya. The Russian ambassador to Libya, Chamov, said to Medvedev, you are a traitor to Russia. And at that point, he was fired. I also know a guy from Russia by the name of Shevchenko. He was a newscaster on the first program of the Russian state television. And he went on the air and said Medvedev has committed treason.
Well, he didn't last long, did he?
He was fired, but now he's back. So we're hoping that with Putin, a degree of firmness will return.
Why doesn't the Chinese, the Russians, step in to stop this shadow group, which they obviously know exists?
Well, that would mean a world war, because this is where power again is.
All right, yeah. Tell me about the power of this shadow group. How strong is it?
Well, when we look at it, right, it's always hard to identify what's going on right now. But when we go back 10 years or 20 years and we begin to read memoirs and see things, we can figure out, what it was. We can give you a snapshot of what it was, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And again, it's generally this idea of the current heirs and descendants of this Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles complex. They tend to control foreign policy, security policy, and quite a bit of military policy. When it gets to be economics, here there are more competing interests. It's harder for the invisible government to assert its primacy in regard to these things. But what it can do is periodically these cataclysmic events can occur, right? I've seen in my lifetime, two, I guess, the Kennedy assassination, which set the stage for this period of, the immense bloodletting of Vietnam, which thoroughly demoralized the American population, as we saw the low point with that being under Carter. And then we've had the 9/11 case, which has set the stage for this decade of war of civilizations, clash of civilizations.
Webster, I want you to speculate for us on what you think the next horrendous event could be, and then we'll get into your new work on Pearl Harbor and what you say is the assassination of FDR. We'll be back. And, of course, our guest tonight, Webster Tarpley, as we talk about conspiracies, or are they? Back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Webster, your next work on Pearl Harbor and FDR that comes out, as you said, soon. How did you key in on this?
I wrote 20 years ago this summer. I finished the unauthorized biography of George Bush, the elder. By now.
Right.
Bush, what is he? Bush 41. George H.W. Bush, the first one.
The first one.
And in the course of that, I came across this question of Prescott Bush, the father of Bush the elder and the grandfather of the current, the most recent Bush president. And it turned out that Prescott Bush had been a partner of Brown Brothers Harriman, and he had also been the manager of the American interests of a guy called Thyssen, and this is spelled Thyssen, Thyssen, but Thyssen. And Thyssen is one of the main backers of Hitler. He actually wrote a book called I Paid Hitler. That's his sort of autobiography or his memoir.
Mm-hmm. And he was involved in a bank, wasn't he?
Prescott.
Yes.
Yeah, Prescott was involved in the Union Banking Corporation. So this book of mine, the unauthorized biography of George Bush, 1992, which you can also get either at Amazon or you can get it at progressivepress.com out in California. The story is that this was part of the support network for Hitler. It was part of the network that allowed Hitler to seize power with the Nazi Party in 1933. And this is not speculation. Starting in the late 1920s, Prescott Bush managed these what were soon to become Nazi interests here in the United States, and he kept them. And in October of 1942, a good year almost into the war, the alien property custodian, a guy by the name of Crowley, acting under the Trading with the Enemy Act, seized control of the Union Banking Corporation as an enemy alien and as a Nazi bank, controlled, as the order says, by German and Hungarian Nazis. The Hungarian is got to do with the Thyssen family. And with that, a share of stock or a part of the ownership of Union Banking Corporation that had been in the hands of Prescott Bush was seized by the government. So his property was taken, and this was hushed up, but you can find the basic facts in the New York newspapers of the day, although the ones, if you can go back and get the editions, because they used to have several editions of these papers, they tends to disappear from the later editions that more people were likely to read. So it was hushed up. But nevertheless, the fact was there, and in the records of the alien property custodian, that's all there. This book is the source of that story. Many people now know this, right? Other people have come along and pretended to discover it. I can mention names. I can mention people who have sort of taken this over without attribution. They don't care, but that's the source of it. So this is a novel idea. Here we have a ruling class family, although not the most exalted, the Bushes, right? And they're part of, they came to prominence under Bernard Baruch during World War I, and then Prescott Bush got hooked up with Averell Harriman of Skull and Bones and the Brown Brothers Harriman Bank, and that Brown Brothers Harriman Bank was the largest investment bank in the world between the two world wars. It's the largest version of what Goldman Sachs, I guess, is more or less today.
Now, yeah.
Also, it's the most politically powerful of these banks. So that was then, and the thing that I wondered about was how broad is that tendency? In other words, was Prescott Bush and maybe Averell Harriman, were they the only ones in their generation who were willing to support Hitler? Because that's what it comes down to, that they, as a business matter, but also as a matter of ideology, they were favorable to the creation of a Hitler dictatorship in Germany. And they wanted that. They wanted, and I think we can safely say that people of this type wanted it because of Hitler's ability to crush trade unions and lower the standards of living in these countries in the wake of a banking crisis, 1929, and what went on in Germany in the summer of 1931, and also as a counterweight to the Soviets. Right? So for geopolitical reasons and also for reasons of class warfare, the warfare waged by bankers against the rest of us, they supported this. So the question is, how broad was that tendency? And I wanted to revisit this in terms of looking at the U.S. ruling class and where were their sympathies, ruling class, again, being pretty much these Wall Street people. And what you find is overwhelmingly that the U.S. banking elite was pro-fascist. Now, pro-fascist means, first of all, pro-Mussolini, and they had a long time to be pro-Mussolini, from 1922 until 1941 or whenever you want to say. The sympathy for Mussolini's fascism is overwhelming. And again, here it's very, very heavily the breaking of trade unions, the destruction of the workers' movement, and the driving down of wages. Now, when you see these
things that's happening now, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. That's what I was trying to get at. In other words, that's the essence of fascism. And all the stuff about the jackboots, the stormtroopers, the clubs, the street battles, the beating people up, assassinations. Those are the means. But if you look at the main institutional reforms of fascism, it's that trade unions and socialist or other kinds of anti-banker parties cease to exist. They're just gone. And then, depending on the estimates you read, the standard of living is lowered by 30, 40, 50%. And that's sort of what certain forces here in the United States.
By design, except for them. They still live well, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And the difference is, the other difference is, communism and fascism are similar in some ways, but there's one big difference. If communists, somebody like Stalin, takes over a country, the ruling class of bankers tends to be, if not exterminated, then, sent abroad or sent underground or expropriated or whatever it is. Whereas if fascists take over a country, the privileges of the existing ruling class are increased as long as they don't rock the boat, as long as they're willing to put up with these gutter snipes and hooligans running everything. They do fine. So I wanted to look at this. And I was also concerned about the modern tendency to slander and vilify Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, because I think this is also very, very misguided. And a lot of this comes together then on the question of Pearl Harbor, right? Is the people who want to tell you that Roosevelt is this great villain and conspirator and power mad and duplicitous, they try to hang their hat on the Pearl Harbor story. And I decided to look into this. And again, you can pre-order this book at progressivepress.com. The finding is that there are, you can say, if you want to push it, that there were 3 Pearl Harbor conspiracies, and they're all directed against Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Against him.
Against him. Yes, against him. He's the target. Do we want to go through these?
Yeah, let's give us the highlights of the 3, and then we'll break them down.
All right. Well, assuming that people know a little bit about this, we could build up to it.
Well, and also, Webster, it's important for people to know the significance of this as it affects them today. So make sure we do that too.
It's very much linked to the question of, do we keep our economic rights as validated under the New Deal, or do we lose them? Because there are a lot of people telling us that we can't have them. Anyway, look, you're told a lot of fakery about Roosevelt. First of all, Roosevelt provoked Japan. Well, the problem with Japan was something called fascism, and the fact that Japan was a serial aggressor. It was a dyed-in-the-wool, inveterate aggressor. They had attacked maybe not more countries than Hitler, but they had attacked more countries of greater territory and population. In other words, the Japanese had managed to attack China quite a number of times, Manchuria. They had gotten into a little war with the Soviets. With Marshal Zhukov, they had attacked the French colonial empire. They were on their way to attacking the British and the Dutch colonial empires. I think the Portuguese colonial empire fits in there too. And then finally the United States. And they've been doing this. It's a series of aggressions starting in the 1890s, an attack on Russia in 1905, an attack on Germany in 1914. They stole all the German colonies, then into China, Manchuria 1931, the rest of China 1937, the French Indochina, Vietnam 1940, 41, and then finally everything else. So,
did they actually think they could topple these countries?
No, they weren't, thinking that they would go to Europe and take over the Netherlands, but they could take over what we would call today Indonesia because of the oil. So the other thing about the Japanese is they don't need to be provoked. If they want to attack a country, now, of course, we're not talking about the Japanese of today. This is a fundamentally different thing before World War II, right, and for many reasons. They would provoke themselves. In other words, when they wanted to attack Manchuria, China, in 1931, you have this thing called the Mukden incident, which is a false flag. In other words, they start shooting at themselves, and they blame the Chinese, and then they can seize Manchuria. Later on, 1937, they want to attack the rest of China. We have the so-called incident at the Marco Polo Bridge, which is the same thing again. They blow up a piece of track, they blame the Chinese, and off they go. And they don't need to be provoked. They're also experts in sneak attacks, right? Admiral Togo's attack on the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, Darien, that's legendary. So the idea that somehow Japan needed to be provoked, this is crazy. And I go into this because this guy Stinnett, right? There's a Robert Stinnett. You may have had him on your program at different times. This is maybe one of the most influential books of the, what can we say, the anti-Roosevelt school, I would say maybe almost Roosevelt-hating school. But
what would cause the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor?
Well, they're interested in seizing primarily, again, what we would call Indonesia. In other words, their problem is that they want to secure sources of oil and other raw materials that are not subjected to British control or Dutch or U.S. control. So they have to destroy the U.S. fleet. One or two other little things that people always tell, right? That Roosevelt kept the admirals in the dark, right? Roosevelt had these secrets, and he didn't share it with these admirals. Well, the reality is the opposite. That from September 1940 to January 41, and then from May 41 to November 41. So for a lot of the time, many, many months before Pearl Harbor, it's the military and the admirals who deny Roosevelt the secrets. Have you ever seen that Torah?
Oh, sure.
And also,
I love the quote where they said they woke up a sleeping giant. Us.
All right, fine, and that's from Admiral Yamamoto. But there's the scene where E.G. Marshall comes in and says, "What? You've taken Roosevelt off the distribution list for the secrets?"
Yeah.
And the other guy says to E.G. Marshall, "Yeah, because the bosses here say that Roosevelt is a communist." That's the heart of the matter. That you have a clique of people in the military establishment, and we should name them, but they cut off the intelligence to FDR. And the reason for this is the following. A lot of people think when you read these books, they assume Roosevelt is this all-powerful dictator, and everything that goes on in the U.S. federal government is controlled by Roosevelt. Well, this is simply false. We got to remember that the Roosevelt government of December 1941 is a coalition. The Republicans have been brought in. In June of 1940, after the Nazis conquer France, Roosevelt brings in his political enemies. Right? Keep your friends close or your enemies closer. Anyway, he feels that he has to do this. He brings in Colonel Henry Stimson, who is really the dean of the Wall Street banking establishment. I would call him Mr. Invisible Government. He had been in the cabinet under Taft. He'd been in the cabinet under Roosevelt. He was a leading Republican, a Wall Street bond lawyer, exactly the kind of person that I was trying to warn you about in the case of Allen Dulles. So Stimson comes in, and Stimson brings with him a group of people who I think are responsible for a tremendous amount of the grief that we've gone through in this country in the past 50 or 60 years. He brings with him John J. McCloy. Now, John J. McCloy, a lawyer for Rockefeller, would later go on to become, in his own right, the dean of the establishment. He becomes the head of Chase Manhattan Bank and
powerful people.
High Commissioner of Germany. Tremendous political power. So that's McCloy. Then we have Harvey Bundy. Harvey Bundy, not so important himself, but his son, of course, McGeorge Bundy, is the National Security Council under Kennedy. the Vietnam War, the Kennedy assassination on his watch. Then and he becomes the dean of the establishment. So we've got three deans of the establishment so far: Stimson, McCloy, and Bundy. Then we've got Robert Lovett, partner in that same Brown Brothers Harriman Bank we were talking about. Lovett is the guy who chose the Kennedy cabinet, and he chooses a bunch of people. It's about the worst cabinet you can imagine. Dean Rusk as Secretary of State, and above all, Robert McNamara of the Ford Company as the Defense Secretary. The guy's a butcher. The guy's a madman.
Who admitted the Vietnam shortcomings later on in his life.
Yes, he says, sorry, too bad if you died. He's really sorry, and too bad if your father or your son died in Vietnam. So this group, Stimson, but then the younger ones, McCloy, Lovett, Bundy. We can add in Forrestal, Secretary of the Navy, although he didn't last long. He was mentally unstable.
Didn't he kill himself?
Yes, he did. He did away with himself. So these people, one way to understand them is a lot of them are from Skull and Bones, right? The majority of them are from
the old Yale University inside club.
Exactly, as was Averell Harriman, and then Bush the elder, Bush the younger, Kerry, right? We know this group.
Oh, yeah, they're all from that.
Skull and Bones. So essentially, my argument is there's a Skull and Bones clique in the War Department, the Pentagon of the time, for the Army. They have their tentacle in the Navy, and this is the group that wants to see the United States catastrophically defeated at Pearl Harbor. Let me just add.
But why, Webster? Why?
Well, let me just add one thing and then the why. The other guy that you have to know about is this guy, Frank Knox. Now, Frank Knox is not a friend of Roosevelt. This is a guy who ran for vice president for the Republican Party in 1936. The Republican ticket was Alf Landon for president and Frank Knox for vice president. So Roosevelt has invited in, it's like inviting in Palin or something like this, right? So he's got essentially a bunch of Wall Street enemies that he's brought into the cabinet, and he feels, I think, that he has to do it because if he doesn't give Wall Street a share of power, they will sabotage the war effort because, as I mentioned, there's a huge sympathy for fascism in Wall Street, and there's also a growing sympathy specifically for Hitler. And this is one of the dirty secrets of the U.S. ruling elite, that foundations and other entities and many, many academic scribblers have been trying to cover up for many years. Now, why? The why for this group is the following. This group is Anglophiles. They're Wall Street, but they love the British, and they want to support the British in every way. Therefore, they want to bring the U.S. into World War II. However, they don't want to do it Roosevelt's way. They want to do it in such a way that's totally subservient to the British. In other words, they want the U.S. to come into World War II, do what the British tell them, and save the British Empire.
In a secondary position.
That's the goal. So the U.S. remains a junior partner of British imperialism. At the same time, they hate and fear Roosevelt. Now, there are two sort of things you have to bear in mind. The first meeting of Roosevelt and Churchill.
All right, hold that thought right there, Webster. Already at the bottom here, we are going to come back in just a moment with Webster Tarpley as he gets into all of this, which is affecting a lot of us today. If you need to email me, that's George at coasttocoastam.com. We shall be right back. Next hour, we will take your phone calls with Mr. Webster Tarpley as we talk about everything you hear us talking about. Conspiracies, his work, Surviving the Cataclysm, and also his new work that's coming out about Pearl Harbor and FDR. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. George Norrie back with you and Webster Tarpley. Webster, so these lunatics, were they taking a chance thinking that our devastated Pacific Coast Navy fleet would get wiped out, as it did, and that we could very well lose the war? Did they even think about that? Or did they think the British?
Some would say that this was an integral part of the British strategy. The British strategy is always that when you have an ally, even if you win the war, you want that ally to come out as chewed up and as mangled as possible so that you can dominate the post-war. Now, the British version of that was the Japanese should be allowed to expand all over the Pacific. The British even had a plan called the Brisbane Line, which was that that the Japanese should take over just about all of Australia. In practice, it would have been all of Australia. They were willing to give that away. Then the U.S. would have
in return for what?
In return for making sure that the U.S. went into the post-war world in a weakened and savaged state. In other words, this is called treachery.
This is pretty Machiavellian, isn't it?
Yeah, perfidious Albion is the name for Britain in every language of continental Europe. Right, that it's based on trickery. In World War I, the British had pushed the French into the front line. The French came out of it mangled and mauled and divided. So that competition was removed. So I think there's a good argument that the British wanted to maximize U.S. losses. So this group, the Stimson, Lovett, McCloy, Bundy group, they have a name. They're called the Imps of Satan.
The Imps of Satan.
Imps of Satan. That's Lovett and McCloy. They run the Pentagon with what we would call the Pentagon today. So they want to get the U.S. into the war to save the British, but they want to do it in such a way that the U.S. will have extremely heavy losses at some place like...
Are the British in trouble if we don't go into the war?
Absolutely. And Roosevelt recognizes the necessity, whether you like it or not, you're going to have to enter World War II because he's looking at three allies. He's looking at the Soviets, he's looking at China, which is a huge part of the effort against Japan, and he's looking at the British Empire. And the thing that they all have in common at the end of 1941 is they're all about to collapse. And he's propped them up with the Lend-Lease. Now, Lend-Lease is a stroke of genius, right? To get the U.S. Arsenal of democracy going, this is essentially the thing that finally wipes out the unemployment left over from the Great Depression. But this is another reason why the ruling class hates Roosevelt, because they say, wait a minute, Roosevelt, you're creating full employment, and this is creating upward pressure on wages. And we want to keep those wages down, and you're making it impossible for us to do it.
And how many years was Hitler pounding away at Britain before we got into that war?
Well, the war in Europe started in September 1939. The British were alone, so to speak, when the French went down in June of 1940, and therefore until December of 1941. So that period, it's about...
Couple of years.
2 years.
Yeah, okay.
So this is sort of, we can call this the middle group. In other words, the group in the Pentagon, and they have an ally called Richmond K. Turner in the Navy Department.
The Imps of Satan.
The Imps of Satan. That's Lovett and McCloy. And McCloy goes on to be the dean of the establishment, and Lovett goes on to be the guy who picks this disastrous cabinet that Kennedy was saddled with. Now, we want to go back to Pearl Harbor, though, and look at Short and Kimmel, right, the admiral and the general on the scene. And I looked at them and I said, what is their problem, right? They get a dispatch that Roosevelt ordered. On the 27th of November, they get a telegram that says, consider this a war warning. Consider this a war warning. And then there's some other blah, blah, blah.
From Roosevelt.
From essentially the group around him, right? I think it's written by Marshall.
Okay. Did Roosevelt even know about it?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
This is something that he would appear to have ordered. So consider this a war warning. Now, it could have been more explicit. Again, Roosevelt, doesn't get into this level of detail. But consider this a war warning. And at that point, you'd have to say, hey, Admiral Kimmel, hey, General Short, what part of consider this a war warning don't you understand?
Don't you understand? That's right. Get ready.
There's no reconnaissance. They have radar. They don't care about it. They have no aerial reconnaissance. They don't send up these PBYs and these other planes that they have. And above all, naval reconnaissance. They need to send out what we would call picket ships. That would be either destroyers or submarines or frigates or tugs or anything that would float. Sampans, fishing boats with radios.
Anything, in case you could see something.
What the Japanese did was the Japanese had a picket line of their own, and this is what discovered the Doolittle raids. In other words, they had some fishing boats with radios. They see the U.S. carriers. They radio that in, and if the Japanese had been thinking clearly, they would have been able to meet the Doolittle bombers several months later.
I keep forgetting, Webster, we didn't have satellites then. We didn't have the kind of communication systems. We didn't have the Internet. They had to do a lot of this by just manpower, didn't they?
Right, but they did have radar, and they completely disregarded it. And it was, if I'd been one of those commanders, I would have been down at that radar station personally every day telling these guys, you call me, you call me, you call me. Now, here's the problem. The behavior of Kimmel and Short has always been analyzed in what I would call an apolitical way. And I said, what's something comparable? Well, let's look at the fall of France. We mentioned it just a minute ago. In June of 1940, May-June 1940, this huge French army is defeated, right, in a way that, still rankles for the French.
Crush
by
would be a better word.
The Nazis.
Right.
And how is this possible? And you look at it, they're incompetent. They don't mobilize. They don't respond. They're not interested in new developments in military science. And the answer in the case of the French, I think most people would say, is that the French officer corps were either fascists themselves, some of them were pro-Hitler, some of them were defeatists, some of them were the fifth column for these foreign powers.
The French underground was stronger than the military.
Yeah, well, later on, right?
Later
At this
on.
point, there is no French underground.
No,
There's de Gaulle, right? There will be de Gaulle very soon. And you look at Kimmel and Short, and you simply have to say, these officers are defeatists, and they're not interested in fighting fascism, right? Short is obsessed with the threat comes from civilians in Hawaii. He says, put the planes in the middle of the airfield because I'm concerned about sabotage around the edge of the air base.
Yeah.
You look at that. They're not interested in air mobilization. The big thing that had just happened in those terms was the Battle of Britain, about a year before. The Battle of Britain is won by something called the Dowding system. If you've ever seen those war movies with they've got this big table, and they push these tokens around the table, and it says, this is a bunch of messages.
Oh, yeah, I love those maps.
Right?
Yeah.
Eagle Squadron Scramble.
They have ships, right. They move around, little toys.
But this is to mobilize the Spitfires and the Hurricanes to go after the bombers that are coming in. So The idea is that air defense requires radar. It requires a central, what they call a filtering room. This is what's called Bentley Priory, and Dowding was the head of the Royal Air Force who did these things. You look at Short. He has no capability to scramble his airplanes. And you could say, well, maybe the Americans didn't know it. Wait a minute, they did. You look at this Claire Chennault of the Flying Tigers, and he was in Hawaii in the 1920s, and he was teaching the Army pilots how to, first of all, have lookouts. He says, if you can't do anything else, go to the top of a water tower with binoculars and scan the horizon. You'll do better than just waiting for the enemy to come.
Sure.
So no reconnaissance. You're sitting in the middle of an ocean, and you're Kimmel and Short. You get a war warning. There's no reconnaissance. No ships are sent out. No planes are sent out.
And they had about 2 weeks to get ready.
They had at least 10 days, right, from the 27th of November until December 7th. And I would say the answer to that is political. And you look at the U.S. Navy. The predecessor to Kimmel had said to Roosevelt to his face, the officers of the Navy don't have confidence in your administration. In other words, you're a communist. So that's insubordination. And it is, of course, that the privileged classes of the United States, the 1% at the time, were heavily overrepresented, especially in the Navy, but also in the Army. The Army ideology was equally this anti-communist, strike-breaking kind of mentality, but especially the Navy. So the Navy at the beginning of World War II was defeatist. You can look at them. They said, don't have economic sanctions against Japan. Send them all the scrap and oil. When they go into Nanjing in China and kill 500,000 people in a couple of months and do it openly, the question is, how much oil can we give you? How much scrap can we give you? And then, when you have General MacArthur trapped in the Philippines with an army, what does the Navy do? They run away. They just flee. They depart the scene. The Japanese come to invade Wake Island. There's some U.S. ships there. What do? They run away. So the U.S. Navy started World War II with a heavy burden of defeatism. And this, I think, has been completely obscured by, a lot of nonsense. So the question, therefore, is Kimmel and Short are they're incompetent commanders because they don't take seriously the idea that they're going to have to fight World War II against Japan. Was it intentional or was it stupidity? It's a mixture of intent and ideology and so forth. Now, at this point you could say, well, fine, but the point of having a general staff in Washington, right? You have a Navy Department and the Pentagon. They should have said to them, look here, Short, we sent you a war warning, and you say you're on alert against sabotage. Get yourself in gear, right?
Yeah.
Get with the program. That's incompetent. And, hey, Kimmel, get those planes in the air, find out about that radar, Short, find out about the radar, and so forth. Now, this was not done, and this takes us back to the group around Stimson and Marshall. Marshall's very definitely a part of that group. And the ones that I've been mentioning, the Skull and Bones
McCloy,
guys,
Lovett, those people.
The imps of Satan. Now, there's a higher level, which is the other thing to mention. Sir Winston Churchill in Britain, his entire purpose in life is to get the U.S. into World War II, which is understandable. But he wants to do it in a way that will preserve the British Empire. He has had a clash with Roosevelt at the Atlantic Charter, right, when they meet off the coast of Canada in August of 1941, right, the Four Freedoms and all this.
Yeah.
There's a clash, and the clash is Roosevelt says, look, you're not going to be able to keep this empire in the way that you think, and Churchill goes into one of his fits and says, I'm going to preserve the British Empire, that's what we're fighting for, and that's what you're going to be fighting for too, and Roosevelt says no. This is essentially reflected in a very important book called As He Saw It by Elliot Roosevelt, the son who was there, who saw.
He was a witness. Yeah.
Yeah, he's Roosevelt's son and aide. So the British know that if Roosevelt is still in power at the end of the war, their empire is going to be dismantled. And Roosevelt is committed to a condominium of the United States and the Soviets that would put the British in the position of the proverbial third wheel. The other thing that the U.S. ruling class is concerned about is Roosevelt has come up around this time in 1941 with the idea of an economic bill of rights. He wants to, and he articulated this later on in 1944, that Americans have economic rights. We have political and religious rights. We have those in the Bill of Rights, but we need an economic bill of rights that ought to be anchored in the Constitution. You have a right to a job, to an adequate income, to a home, to medical care, to an adequate education, and to kinds of social insurance, right, against unemployment or old age or disability or sickness. If you're a farmer, you deserve to get a parity price. And if you're a businessman, you deserve to be free from monopoly competition and cartels. Now, the thing that they're afraid of is that if Roosevelt wins World War II, he's going to come out of this at, 60, 65 years old, right? Not that old. There could be...
Well, it was then. That was old then.
Well,
maybe not.
Adenauer, a little bit later, was in office at 70 to 80.
Yeah.
You can't tell. Anyway, they have every reason to be afraid. They're afraid that Roosevelt will have a fifth term and maybe a sixth term, and that he's going to crush the power of Wall Street once and for all. The thing that we're fighting today, right, the 1%, that the 1% will essentially be deprived of this privileged status that they've usurped inside public life. So they're determined to get rid of Roosevelt. This comes back in a second. What Churchill contributes to the disaster at Pearl Harbor is this. There were two kinds of codes. There's the Purple Code, which is the Japanese diplomatic code. Good to have. The U.S. has this. You can know today what the Japanese ambassador is going to say tomorrow. Mm-hmm. That's very valuable. But there's another code called JN25, or the 5-number code. And that will tell you which Japanese aircraft carrier is going to go where and when. And that, for military purposes, is critical. The thing you need, right? That's really what you need. The outcome is, based on the study by Rusbridger and Nave, one of them being a code breaker from the Royal Australian Navy, now deceased, is that the British could read a great deal of this JN25 5-number code, so that Churchill knew when and where the attack was coming and failed deliberately to share this with Roosevelt. So he contributed in the same way that this group in Washington did to the idea of get the U.S. into the war, but with maximum losses and the maximum possibility that the Japanese will take over the entire Pacific as a vast, doomed area.
Which you're saying the British didn't care about.
Which they indeed wanted to see happen
Yeah.
in order to cripple the United States for the post-war.
They wanted us down to our knees that badly?
The whole point of this is world domination. That is the name of the game. And anything will be done in the service of world domination. And Churchill had said as much earlier in life. When there was a danger of the United States becoming the top maritime and above all seizing naval supremacy after World War I, there's a speech I quote in the book, ProgressivePress.com. He basically says, we have got to do anything possible to maintain the world naval supremacy that we've had since the defeat of Napoleon at Trafalgar, in the early.
Is this view still alive today, Webster?
The view, I think, has now sort of merged into what they would call a joint Anglo-American imperialism, which they propose to maintain in the world. Yes, so the imperial urge is there. But the thing that we've seen is that after the war, the inherent anti-colonial, anti-imperialist culture of the United States has been systematically demolished and subverted and perverted to the point where you get things like the Vietnam War. But look, let's just go back for a second to that clique in the Pentagon, right? Stimson, Bundy, McCloy, and Lobbett. Look what they gave us. They gave us this 20 to 30 to 40-year period centering on the Vietnam War. This is the invisible government that brought you the Kennedy assassination, the Bay of Pigs, the Gulf of Tonkin, Vietnam, and it reaches into the Iran-Contra realm, and you can say that it establishes a kind of institutional culture which brings us down to 9/11. In other words, this is the mother of the conspiracies. So it's the common matrix of this chain of tragic events, right? RFK, JFK, MLK.
All right, if that's all true, what's next? There's got to be something else.
All right, right now, let's take the next 72 hours. We have Nicolas Sarkozy, President of France. He is the most pro-CIA, pro-NATO president of France that we've ever had in the Fifth Republic.
He may not win.
He may not win. But now here's the thing. You've got to realize he grew up in a family that was essentially the Wisner family. If you know Frank Wisner of the OSS and the CIA and his son Frank Wisner Jr., this is a CIA State Department family, rather highly placed through various marriages and divorces that I won't go through because it's confusing.
All right, but what good is it?
Nicolas Sarkozy grew up in a household dominated by this Wisner family.
So he loses. What good is he?
The goal is to keep him in office. Now, this is the thing that I would invite people to be vigilant about in the next 72 hours. You know the famous Wag the Dog, right? So the Wag the Dog movie is we have a demagogic president who thinks he's going to lose. What does he do? He starts a war.
Right before, yeah.
And we know that Syria, right? Syria is the focus of a lot of this stuff right now. We've got the essence of what's going on in Syria, as I saw myself in Homs, right, on the ground, is that there are NATO death squads. There are Al-Qaeda and other terrorists who have been brought in from a vast part of the globe to do nothing but kill in Syria. And that's what they do.
So what are you predicting? Well, we're coming up to the top.
We have to be on red alert for the next 72 hours because the idea that you can have a U.S. asset as president of France is of infinite value to these people. They could not have done Libya without having Sarkozy.
All right, let's get into that, Webster, when we come back. I want to get your views specifically on this alert that you think could happen, and then we'll take phone calls with the final hour on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, this hour we'll take your phone calls with Webster Tarpley, his website, tarpley.net. Get a lot of information there on his website. We shall be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Webster, the 72-hour red alert. Tell us a little bit more. Can you be a little more specific on what you think could happen?
Well, the question is whether NATO intelligence is willing to simply sit by and let Hollande, the socialist, become president of France. And I'm sure they have hooks into him, but it's not going to be the same kind of obedience and complicity that they've got with Sarkozy. So we had Sarkozy's foreign minister, Juppé, say at the end of last week, it's time now to recognize that this NATO the UN observer team under Kofi Annan, after that's gone into Syria, that's a failure. Now we got to get ready to attack, said the French foreign minister. So if he's calling for an attack last week, I think Sarkozy would rather have the attack come now rather than later in the month.
The French would attack on their own?
Well, that's what they did in Libya, didn't they? They bombed first. They didn't wait for anybody. They were out there well before anybody else.
Yeah,
and that was Sarkozy. So now he's fighting for his life. And I can't tell what's going on, but I'm just saying, if you want to look at an obvious danger, this is the one. When you have a colonial war going on in a former colonial country like Syria, right? Remember, France was the colonial power. They ran Syria well into the 1940s. That's not so long ago. So if a terror event takes place in India, the British are always a suspect, and so on down the line. Something with Syria. Suppose let's imagine that a Syrian warship is accused of sinking a cruise ship in the Mediterranean and killing God knows how many thousand civilians. That's the magnitude that they would need. So that's just a possible hypothetical event. And the main thing is inoculate yourself that you're not going to believe that if it happens. And if you have access to Twitter, right, you can go and comment on the passing scene, as we have a right to do under the First Amendment.
Would this be the mind of a conspiracy theorist?
I think this is simply political realism. And again, I'm not looking for conspiracies, but you can just see if you've been studying NATO intelligence for decades, and I guess I have, and
yes,
Gladio and some things like this, then you sort of begin to see how they think, and I guarantee you somebody in NATO intelligence is thinking that. Whether it'll happen or not, I can't say.
Webster, before we go to calls, with all this that has been going on, and assuming that it's all true, why? What do they want out of this?
For people at this level, the purpose of life comes down to power and the maintenance of power. We also have to remember that since we're dealing with an oligarchy, we have to remember that the only possible purpose of an oligarchy is to preserve oligarchy. That's why tyrants sometimes ending up, doing some things that are surprisingly good. If you remember your old high school history textbook, it would talk about enlightened despotism, that somebody like Peter the Great, he did a lot of bad things, but he did some pretty good ones too, or, Frederick the Great of Prussia, or even Louis the 14th, maybe up to a point, I don't know. Sometimes a tyrant can transcend himself by, doing some things that are remarkably good. But an oligarchy is going to sit there and be an oligarchy, and it's very hard for it to move itself, because if one oligarch says, well, let's reform this whole thing, then there are immediately 10 oligarchs, that guy's enemies, that are against it, you see? So the purpose is world domination.
All right, let's go to the phones. We'll go to west of the Rockies. Susan is with us in Phoenix, Arizona. Hi, Susan. Welcome to the program.
Hi, good morning. I can't believe it's taken me 5 years to get on.
Well, I'm glad you did.
Yes, I wanted to ask, I've been reading a lot of information and hearing things, and he mentioned about the war and why that we got into it in World War I and World War II.